All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Millennials Are Old podcast. And you know what, Brian? We've both been working really hard recently, and I think you and I both deserve a nice long vacation. Maybe like a road trip? Do you think you'd want to plan that with me?
Boy, I've been thinking that too. There's so many places we could go, so many sights to see.
Yeah, exactly. And you know what? Do you have a passport, Brian?
No.
Ah, shit. Because I was thinking maybe a country like Australia, just like a nice big country with a lot of sights to see and lots of very nice people. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and that song Big Country was written about it.
I believe that song Midnight Oil was written about it too. The song that very much says, or I should say, talks about the incredibly like wholesome history of Australia.
Yeah, the song about how chill and good it is there.
But you know what? Speaking of road trips and good and chill Australian things, let's get into this week's episode, which is our review of the 2005 horror film Wolf Creek. Now, this was my choice for this week's episode. Brian, what did you know about Wolf Creek before I recommended it for this episode?
Nothing. I knew nothing about it. You said the title, and I kind of had a flash in my head of an idea of the type of movie that it was going to be. And I think I was halfway right, but I went in pretty much blind, except for what little bit you told me about it.
That's really fascinating to me because, like, and we'll definitely get into it, obviously, in this episode, but this was kind of a big deal when it came out. This movie was pretty popular, pretty notorious, pretty infamous. Everybody from Roger Ebert to Quentin Tarantino were talking about it, so I'm kind of surprised you had never heard of it before.
So in the 2000s, I was kind of withdrawing from a lot of the zeitgeist, I think. I was in 2005, but I would have probably just been a teenager about. And I was kind of getting really into old shit. So I was getting into my old horror stuff and my old music. And I wouldn't say I was quite like I don't know, what's the Reddit term? Like a defender kid. I had like a disinterest kind of in kind of current trends, and particularly at the time in regards to horror. So this wouldn't have even been on my radar.
No, that's totally fair. And I think I may have mentioned it to you, but I've had this theory for a while that mid 2000s horror, like especially the mid 2000s, but just the 2000s in general, was a pretty weak time in horror in general.
Let me do you one better. The 2000s were a bad time for popular culture. They were a bad time for music. They were a bad time overall for film, particularly for genre films like horror and action films. Kind of a wasteland.
Which is funny because that's oftentimes the well that I dig in when we do these episodes.
And that's the one thing, because after I watched this last night and I sat and I thought, what do I want to talk about with this? And then I started thinking about it and I mulled it over more today throughout the day, getting ready for this. And I thought, like, this is such a mid 2000s movie. It is such a type of horror movie that would not have been made 5 years earlier and probably wouldn't have been made 5 or 6 years after.
No, absolutely, 100%. And before we mention anything more, I want to get into it because I totally agree. This is absolutely a mid 2000s horror movie. Could not be made at any other time. So, fittingly, this movie came out in 2005. It was rated R, very unsurprising. Actually, though, we do have the unrated cut, or I should say we reviewed the unrated cut for this episode because, believe it or not, the R-rated theatrical cut is very hard to find nowadays.
Oh, just because people have defaulted to getting the unrated one for so long?
Yes, exactly. And I will mention there's two changes, one major change and one minor change. Otherwise than that, the cuts in the theatrical cut are pretty minimal, but there's two major scenes that were cut out, or I should say just two scenes in general that were cut out.
There's a specific instance of violence that when I was watching last night occurred and I thought, oh, this is an unrated film.
Well, once we get to that point, you might be surprised that that was not cut at all, if this is the scene I'm thinking of. But
Oh, okay.
But this film was directed by Greg McLean. He also directed the sequel, but he's not directing the third movie. He also, I don't believe, directed the TV show, because this was also a TV show was made about Wolf Creek, a 2-season long TV show.
That's so weird to me. You were telling me that. And then when I watched it, I was like, there's a TV series based on this.
There's also a third movie in development hell, which we will certainly get into why it's in development hell, because it's a fucking doozy.
Well, like the TV show thing is like, okay, I get that there's a TV show based on the Evil Dead. It's about Ash, Bruce Campbell's charismatic. It's a good versus evil story. I even can get like that there's a story based on, even though I don't like it or give a shit, that there's like a Norman Bates TV show because that's this iconic character. What is the Wolf Creek TV show?
I think it's mostly about, and spoilers to the audience that have not seen this movie, it's mostly about our villain, Mick Taylor. That's what I'm assuming it's about.
It must be, right?
It would almost have to be. Like, maybe he has, like, accomplices or something, or maybe, like, people in his life, but it's got to be about Mick Taylor.
his childhood or something. I don't know.
Yeah. This film was also written by Greg McLean as well, and it was produced by Greg McLean and a gentleman named David Lightfoot. I was not able to really find a whole lot of information about David Lightfoot, but what information I was able to find is he mostly works on Greg McLean movies. And then speaking of, he's most well known for this series, the, once again, sequel, the 2016 film called The Darkness, the 2007 film called Rogue, which is a movie about a killer crocodile, and a movie that I'd heard of, but I didn't know he directed it, a movie called The Belko Experiment, which I've not seen, but I've heard about that movie.
Never heard of any of these. Rogue sounds cool. I love a giant crocodile or a giant alligator.
Yeah, it came out in, I think, 2007, which 2007, 2008 was the peak of deadly crocodile movies in the 2000s, so that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm down. Did you see Crawl from about 2 years ago?
No, I did not.
I loved it. It's so stupid, man.
Yeah. As we were mentioning earlier, the film has a unrated and theatrical cut. The theatrical cut is 99 minutes, and the unrated cut is about 104 minutes long. We watched the unrated cut because, as I mentioned earlier, it is much easier to find than the theatrical cut. And this movie had a budget of about 1.1 million US dollars, or about 1.4 million Australian dollars, and it grossed roughly 27.7 million US, or about 35 million Australian dollars worldwide. So this film was a gigantic box office success when it came out.
I mean, the film, just the sets on there, the way it's filmed, it's all very utilitarian. So must have been almost all profit there.
Well, I mean, I will agree with that, but you got to admit, for a movie that costs, 1.1 million US dollars, I think it's a pretty good looking movie.
Yeah, no, it looks great. It's very well crafted. I just mean, like, it's like when you watch a film that's pretty low budget and you can tell the filmmakers have really, like, they've used that budget kind of to their advantage. Like, they've planned out all their sets and they've figured out a way to work with that kind of modest, monetary access.
No, you are correct. Absolutely. I mean, there's one major location in the film. Otherwise than that, they're basically all just nature locations, essentially. Yeah. And talking about people who may or may not love this movie. So on Rotten Tomatoes, it has a 54% critic score and a 49% audience score. So this movie is rather divisive. Some people like it. Some people hate it. Notably, and I've told you multiple times as we were chatting before recording this episode, but a noted person who hated this movie was Roger Ebert, who gave this film a notorious 0 stars and a thumbs down. And guess what? He didn't even watch the fucking movie in its entirety.
That's classic Ebert. And the thing is, like, I appreciated this movie. I find it really interesting. I didn't, love this movie right off the bat, I'll say. But Roger Ebert sucks at reviewing horror films. He didn't like them. He didn't understand them. He didn't seem to view them as an art form. I don't know why he bothered to review them.
Yeah, 100%. And I know I've mentioned this to you before, but, if you're not a fan of a certain genre as a critic of some type, just don't review it. It's that simple. It's not that fucking hard.
I mean, anyone should review whatever they want, obviously. But if you just straight up are not a fan, you're not the audience for something, you probably don't have any insight into whether it's good or bad.
Exactly. That would be like me being a music critic and reviewing a country album. I'd be like, I don't like country. I have no purpose talking about this. And I would recuse myself from doing that if I had to.
Yeah, because it's one of those things, like, if you're just right off the bat, you're not a fan of this genre. This isn't a thing that you like. And I gotta say, Roger Ebert, I can't think of any horror movies that he's loved. There's probably movies that he retroactively has decided he's loved.
Didn't you like The Exorcist?
Probably.
Because I feel like that's like the one horror movie that every critic, even at the time, for the most part, was like, okay, this is the one good horror movie.
Yep. And that kind of made me dislike that movie for a while. Not dislike it, but kind of made me react against it. So do we know what scene he walked out in? Will we talk about it when we get there?
We will. I don't know which scene it is for sure, but I have a pretty good idea on what scene it is. And then speaking of scenes, let's get into some trivia here. Now, this one's going to be a fairly long section. I didn't include a lot of trivia from IMDb, but a lot of trivia that I found around the production and around the story of this film, because on the DVD I have, it says based on a true story. And unlike a lot of other based on true story movies, there's a little more truth into this than a lot of those movies. I'm just going to say that. So it's a little grim. This movie is very grim, just to be very clear here.
I mean, even before you told me that, I gotta say, this is like a bleak movie. It just is.
And then speaking of bleak, my first trivia fact actually has to do with the bleakness here. So the first fact I have here is, unbeknownst to the crew, the abandoned mine where they chose to film had actually been the site of a real-life murder of a woman. The filming prompted a protest from locals who erroneously thought the film was based on those events. So, yeah.
I mean, like, I don't care too much about that in isolation. It is a little weird not to tell the crew. I gotta say, I don't think I would care if I were a crew member necessarily, as long as we weren't like making a mockery of what happened, which they weren't. Like, I actually think this is a pretty tasteful film for what it is. But it is weird that it seems like they consciously were like, we're not going to tell the crew a murder happened here.
And that's actually the least bleak fact I have here. So, or I should say one of them.
Strap in, folks.
Absolutely. So the next fact I have here is during filming, there had been no, or I should say before filming, there had been no rainfall for 10 years in the area where the movie was filmed. And subsequently, the first day, it rained. And it rained for 21 of their 25 total shooting days.
They didn't expect or intend that, and it probably fucked up the works, huh?
Yes, it did. But honestly, I think they did a pretty good job of it for the most part, because you could barely tell it was raining.
No, in fact, as I was settling in, watching it last night, I thought, like, wow, the feeling of this movie that I think I can feel is like this feeling of oppressive heat defines this movie to me.
Well, I mean, that's the Outback in general, because I might as well just get into it right now. So the Australian Outback, for people who don't know, it's not just the name of a restaurant where they have shrimp on the barbies and bloomin' onions, but it's also a region in Australia which makes up roughly about 70 to 80% of the Australian continent. And it has roughly about 850 to 900,000 people currently living in it right now, which would give it a population density of about 0.15 people per square mile. So to give you a little context here, there are entire sections of the Australian Outback that are just completely devoid of people. And in fact, another little trivia fact I have here about the Outback is there is a single cattle farm, and I believe the state of South Australia, one of Australia's 7 states, or I should say 6 states and 1 territory. I made that error before, but in South Australia, there is a cattle farm there that is roughly the size of New Jersey and has 20 people living and working on it. That's how rural Australia is.
Terrifying. Just existentially terrifying to me.
So if you see a person like Mick Taylor or just anybody out there, you'd be like, why the fuck are you out here?
I guess, like, you telling me that does add a little bit of understanding to this movie. Because to me, now knowing that, I feel like if I was on a road trip, if you and I, let's say we're doing a road trip in the Outback and there's just a guy there, you immediately kind of should be, like, on guard.
Yeah, no, 100%.
Like, I wasn't thinking about it that way watching it last night. And that might have been some kind of cultural context that was lost on me. But when I think about it now, I'm like, oh, well, I mean, we'll get to it. But it paints even when they first meet him a little differently.
No, for sure. I mean, it would be like going out to like West Texas and like just seeing a random redneck. You'd be like, why the fuck are you out here? And you're driving through,
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, they might even be totally harmless, but you're just like, why are you out here? This is really fucking weird. And then, you know what? We've talked about Mick Taylor enough. Speaking of weird, so might as well just get into the inspiration for Mick Taylor, who is played by the actor John Jarratt. Now, Mick Taylor was based on 2 infamous Australian killers. The main inspiration by far was the Australian serial killer Ivan Milat, otherwise known as the Backpacker Killer, who killed at least 7 people in Australia from the years of 1989 to 1992, and I believe he was apprehended in 1994. I'm not going to get too in-depth with him because we're actually going to get a little bit into his crimes in the synopsis here, because a lot of the things that Mick Taylor does in this movie were taken directly from things that Ivan Milat actually did to his victims. So very morbid there. Although I will say some interesting facts here, a couple interesting facts. So Ivan Milat, after he was apprehended, he actually died in prison, I believe, in 2019. So fairly recently, of course. And at one point, he cut off his pinky finger to try to force an appeal with the Supreme Court.
That's so fucking dumb. Like, what the...
That didn't work out, and he
Yes.
never got his pinky reattached. And at one point also, he went on a 9-day hunger strike where, and this is what it said on Wikipedia, I don't believe this, but this is what it said. They said he lost 25 kilograms, which is the equivalent of 55 pounds over 9 days, which is insane. I don't believe that.
I should be so lucky.
And he did that because he wanted a PlayStation in his cell.
No, look, I very much believe in like ethical prisons and shit, but like, no, why would you get that? They don't give a shit if you don't eat.
Well, at least in America, they do. They will force feed people. They will get a court order to force feed people. That is the thing. So they kind of do care, but they also kind of don't care. Let's be real here.
Yeah.
And then a couple other facts here. So he was one of 14 children. He was the 5th of 14 children.
Always an ingredient towards a bad guy.
Yeah.
Deep middle childhood.
Yeah, Jesus Christ. And also, final fact here, this was the one that blew my mind. I watched an entire hour and a half long documentary about this guy. So at one point, Ivan Milat had affairs with 3 of his sister-in-laws.
He's just playing a game all at once. Like,
no, at different times, but yeah, he had affairs with 3 of his sister-in-laws.
wow, wow. I mean, he must have been laying pipe. Good-looking guy.
For Australian standards in the 70s and 80s, he was considered an attractive man. He had like jet black hair, like mutton chops. He was like an Australian redneck, like archetype to the core, which is why Mick Taylor being based on him makes a lot of fucking sense.
Yeah, I am looking at pictures of him, and I mean, I don't think he's attractive, but I kind of see how.
You could absolutely see a type of woman that would absolutely fucking love this guy.
Yeah.
And the other Australian killer that Mick Taylor was based on was a guy by the name of Bradley John Murdoch, who murdered backpacker Peter Falconio and attempted to abduct and rape his girlfriend. Now, fortunately, she was able to escape, but Peter Falconio was never found, and obviously he's presumed to have been murdered and killed. But Bradley John Murdoch is still alive. He's currently in prison, I believe, until like 2035 or something like that. Because Australia doesn't really have life without parole. In fact, Ivan Milat was one of the few Australians to ever get life without parole.
So I'm looking at pictures of Murdoch. He is not as handsome.
He's a very scary looking man.
He looks very grumpy.
Yeah, he does. And then some more lighthearted elements here. So Mick Taylor's actual characterization, so his mannerisms, speaking style, accent, etc., was actually based on John Jarrett's father, who was like an Australian redneck guy. But John Jarrett himself is like a very soft-spoken, kind of like artsy-fartsy, like Sydney, Australia guy. So nothing like his character in this movie.
That kind of makes his dad sound kind of cool, because the kind of characterization of him that way, not the murderous part of him, but the way he talks, I mean, it's unsettling and it's kind of like sus, but like the way he presents himself, right, is as this kind of low-key, unassuming guy.
No, for sure. Like, he was the type of guy that you would see in a bar that you wouldn't really want to talk to, but at the same time, it's like, I can understand why people would want to be friends with you, I guess. I just don't want to be a friend with you.
Yeah.
And then as well, so Mick Taylor's other characterizations were also based on stereotypical worldwide known Australians, such as Steve Irwin and Rod Ansell, otherwise known as the real-life inspiration for Crocodile Dundee. And they mention that in the movie, especially Crocodile Dundee, that's a knife, this is a knife, and it becomes more morbid in this movie than in the original.
One of the things that was interesting to me about this movie is, this is an Australian movie. Every character in this film is Australian, but you have the other Australian characters kind of mocking him for being Crocodile Dundee-esque, which to me is fascinating because, we in America, that's what most of us think Australia just is. And then you're thinking like, I guess if I'd thought about it for 2 seconds, it would have hit me. But when you get to that scene where, someone says to him, one of these kind of touristy, I guess like college kids, you might call them, says to him, oh, you get to say cool stuff like that's not a knife. This is a knife. And he kind of laughs at our murderer here, gets mocked. And you kind of think like, oh, this is kind of highlighting, I thought, like a little bit of like a class disparity. Not that this is a film about class.
I totally get what you're saying, but what's funny is that, of course we mentioned that that's a stereotypical, depiction of Australians, but Australia is actually one of the most urbanized countries in the entire world. Like, there's actually very few Australian rednecks in comparison to most of the rest of the population.
Because the centers of its population are all in urban areas.
They're all in urban areas and they're all on the coast. Like, there's very few people in the outback or even like outside of maybe 10 miles from the coast.
Okay.
So there's probably like 95 of these college kids versus like 5, maybe at most, Australian rednecks. Like, Australian rednecks are very uncommon. Yeah, I mean, it would be like going to like New York State and just being like, oh yeah, these fucking rednecks in New York State. It's like, there's not really a lot of those. I mean, there are some, but there's not a lot of those,
Almost pointless to point them out.
Yeah, exactly. And another fun fact I have here is at around the 43-minute mark in the movie, the sign at the entrance of the old mining company site, where, of course, Mick Taylor takes his victims, is called the Navatilum or something like that mine. And it was Ivan Milat's name spelled backwards with an H in the middle for some reason, I guess, to make it a little less obvious. But yeah. Navitalum or something like that. Yeah, and it's just Ivan Milat's name spelled backwards with an H in there. And last fact I have here is, and this is very rare, I think we might have mentioned this one other time for a movie we reviewed, but this movie was shot entirely in chronological order.
I guess it would have to be because there's a lot of wear and tear to the main actors. That makes sense in a way. Does that track?
Yeah, absolutely. And then also as well, like just the locations and everything. Like I'd imagine it'd be kind of hard to shoot the way that this movie is, because it is like a documentary and almost like voyeuristic style movie.
That was one of my thoughts watching this. So this is not a type of horror film that I watch a lot. And one of the things I said to you is that this is one of those things where it almost kind of doesn't feel like what I would call horror in the strict sense. It's more like, even though it is to some degree sort of fictionalized, it's almost like a true crime thing where it's more about documentation of like atrocities happening.
Yes. And speaking of that, let's get into the synopsis here. So, as I mentioned to you last night, this isn't really a 3-act movie. This is more of a 2-act movie, which I think kind of makes sense for the true crime aspect. Because in true crime documentaries, it's oftentimes, set up, blah, 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 crime happens, and then solving the crime or just getting through until the end of the episode. And that's what this movie really is, because the literal first half is all character development, and the second half is just carnage, just all carnage.
There is a very, like, about 43, 44 minutes in, there is like a delineation where it's like, okay, the barbarism starts and it just doesn't stop.
It doesn't really. And a lot of the movie kind of builds up to that tension, but at the literal halfway point, that's when the carnage just fucking goes. So this synopsis is going to be rather thin because, like I said, the first half of the movie doesn't really have a whole lot to talk about, but of course we will talk about it. So the very first moments of the movie, so there's an opening text that claims that roughly 30,000 people in Australia go missing every year. 90% are found within the month, and many others are never seen again. And supposedly this is the true crime story of these people who are never seen again. Once again, this movie has a little bit more true crime factual history in it than, let's just say, something like the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, because it was actually based on real crimes. And I will say one thing I totally forgot to mention earlier. So with Ivan Milat, he did not necessarily reside in the outback. He actually killed people around the Belanglo State Forest, which is maybe about an hour away from Sydney. So not that far away, but still rural enough. And not like the outback at all. It's like a big forested area, unlike the outback, which is almost all desert. So anyways, in 1999, 2 British tourists, Liz Hunter, played by the actress Cassandra Magrath, and Christy Earle, played by the actress Kesty Morassi, are backpacking across Australia with Ben Mitchell, played by the actor Nathan Phillips, an Australian friend. Ben buys a dilapidated car for their journey from Broome to Cairns, which Broome is in the state of Western Australia and Cairns is in Queensland. So probably like a good 20-hour drive that they're fucking doing here. And there's not really much to mention in this opening scene. It's basically just young kids partying. Who gives a fuck? But there's one scene here that was actually cut out of the theatrical cut for some reason, where Christy and Ben wake up next to each other in a bed. And for whatever reason, that was just cut out of the theatrical cut. I don't know if it was for censorship reasons or for plotting, but that was cut out of the theatrical cut. So not a very important scene, but it was one I had to mention because it's just one of the 2 scenes that were taken out of the theatrical cut. So then we get some scenes of the Australian outback, dialogue about, romance and love stuff and general dialogue. And eventually we get to a scene in a rural pub where a couple of gross guys sexually harass our main characters. And I kind of like this setup scene because it kind of makes you think, if you don't know enough about this movie, that it's like, oh, these 3 rednecks are going to be the ones like torturing these kids. And then they just never show up again.
I mean, again, that's kind of what I assumed was going to happen. Like, you told me a little bit about the film leading up to me watching it, but I thought that these guys were going to lead into like our main guy who you'd mentioned. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, absolutely, 100%. So that scene is really good at like setting up just how, these kids could absolutely be victims of monsters at any given chance.
Yeah, I thought that was a scene that really making clear that like these kids aren't at home. They're not at a place where they know what's going on. They don't know how to act here, and they're outsiders.
No, absolutely, 100%. So we, once again, spend a lot of time with these characters at the very beginning. The trio eventually make their way to Wolf Creek National Park, which is an actual national park in Australia, although it's actually spelled with an E instead of just wolf without the E. It is the crater when they're talking about, like, it hasn't rained here, impact crater, and they're doing, like, the flyover thing. Like a proto-drone shot. They might have actually gotten, like, helicopter footage. That was actually Wolf Creek.
Has anything ever happened, anything, I guess, horrible that we know of ever happened in the real Wolf Creek?
Not that I'm aware of, no. It was mostly just the mine and then, of course, the events relating to Ivan Milat and Bradley John Murdoch.
Okay.
Which happened nowhere near Western Australia. I believe Bradley John Murdoch happened in the Northern Territories and Ivan Milat happened in New South Wales. So yeah, opposite side of the country. They discover that their watches have stopped and the car will not start. After dark, a man once again named Mick motherfucking Taylor, played by John Jarrett, comes across them and offers to tow them to his camp to repair the car. The group goes with him to an abandoned mining site several hours south of Wolf Creek, which once again, you know what, I understand you have this piece of shit car, you're in the middle of the desert, whatever. Why the fuck would you take hours-long trips away from where your original starting point was?
Civilization, yeah.
Just crazy. Even if this guy was nice, I would never fucking do that. That's insane.
No, but it's also like this guy's just here. Like you're not expecting anyone else out here, and this guy's just found you, and you're like, okay.
Just terrifying. Just absolutely fucking terrifying. I don't care if this guy's Mr. fucking Rogers himself. I would be like, get the fuck away from me. Ah, Jesus. Mick then regales them with tall stories of his past while making a show of fixing their car. He then gives the group water, which causes them to fall unconscious. Now, I know we talked a little bit about Mick Taylor's characterization, and I want to talk a little bit about his dialogue before he starts the carnage. So I think it's really interesting. The first thing he says to Ben is he asks him where he's from, and he says, "I'm from Sydney." And John Jarrett says, "Oh, the poofter capital of Australia," which poofter is a derogatory term for gay people. So we have a homophobic. He later says some like anti-tourist things, so he's like xenophobic. Yeah. He's just a bigoted, weird, off-putting fucking asshole.
That's a very like realistic type of thing where Taylor says those things, you know, pseudo affectionate, like he's saying them like it's like banter, like he's joking, but he's saying them very clearly to like make these kids kind of ill at ease and kind of not sure what to think of him. That's how I read that anyways.
No, exactly. It's kind of like when you like interact with a boomer and they're like, "Hey, those, you know, trannies or whatever," and you're just like, yeah,
exactly. They just need to get it out there.
Exactly. But yeah, so they have this conversation. They talk about many different things. You can tell, you know, Christy and, you know, fucking Liz are just like, this is fucking weird. I don't want anything to do with this. But Ben is just like, yeah, you know, this guy's all right, I guess. He just doesn't even like have a radar
does not
of danger here.
Pick up on the vibes at all.
Which I will say at the very end of this movie, and I should say at the very end of this review, I do have a bit of a feminist analysis. So I think this movie is kind of a feminist movie. And I think you can kind of view it as like a very much, almost kind of like a rape culture movie to a certain extent.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so as I got to the end of the movie, because you were telling me that, and I was looking out for it, and I think I see what you, because it's very much like the setup, the scene that we're talking about right now, the whole subtext of it is that the women are picking up on like a bad vibe that the guy isn't, you know, they're sensing this growing animosity coming off of Mick Taylor. And this guy is just like, thinks that he's got everything figured out. He's very comfortable with the situation he's in. He's like, everything's fine.
Because, yeah, Ben has never had to worry about any of that in his entire life. And even then, you know, when they're at the pub and those guys sexually harass Christy and Liz, he's a little off-put by it. And he's like, wait, people talk that way? And it's like, yeah, people do talk that way to women a lot. So, and he doesn't really even know how to handle it. He just kind of like, almost kind of runs away with his tail between his legs. Which, to be fair, if like 3 aggro buff rednecks came after me, I would run away too.
Yeah, what are you going to do?
Exactly. All right, so once again, we're at the exact halfway point in the plot. Let's just get into it. So everybody falls asleep. Liz awakens gagged and tied in a shed. She breaks free and hears Mick torturing Christy in a garage. It is implied that Mick had sexually assaulted her. Now, unfortunately, Brian, I do have to get to the part of the episode where I have to address the elephant in the room here. So in real life, John Jarrett was accused of rape. He was accused of rape. Allegedly, it happened in 1975 or 1976. It was with a former roommate of his that lived with him and his girlfriend, future wife at the time. Now, to be fair, I watched a whole documentary on this. He did go to trial. He was found not guilty. He also later sued a publication that claimed he got away with rape. So legally speaking, he didn't do it. But I watched the documentary and I'm not going to say he did it, but he doesn't come across great in the documentary. I'm just going to be honest. So watching this scene where, you know, Mick is torturing this woman and, of course, making very overt references to the fact that he horribly, like, sexually assaulted her, makes the scene even more, like, horrifying to watch in retrospect because he might have actually done something similar to this in real life. Obviously not as violent, but still.
I am glad that you waited until after I had viewed the movie to tell me that, because if I had known that coming in, it's all I would have been able to think about.
Yeah, and you know what's weird about it too is that so John Jarrett in real life, as I said, is like a Sydney, Australia, almost kind of like fancy guy, very well like cultured, very soft spoken. You know, he was in a lot of like early sort of maybe like early modern Australian cinema. So he got his start in the mid 70s. He was in a movie called Picnic at Hanging Rock, which is considered like one of the most famous Australian movies of all time. And he was also in Mel Gibson's very first movie. So this guy is like a fixture in Australia. He was on a popular sitcom called McLeod's Daughters, like a family sitcom. He was Ned Kelly in like an Australian miniseries like Epic. Also, he was the original, and this was the funniest one to me. He was the original presenter of the Australian TV show Better Home and Gardens, which is a home improvement show.
Oh my.
But this movie was really the first movie and his first role that really like kind of shot him into international stardom. You know, as I linked to you last night, he ended up being in Django Unchained because Quentin Tarantino loves this movie. So like in 2017, like John Jarrett's career was at his peak. And then this accusation, which once again, legally speaking, he was found not guilty. So if anyone listens to this episode, there's no libel lawsuit. I'm not saying he did it. Legally speaking, he didn't do it, but it does kind of make this scene even more horrifying in retrospect.
As you're talking about this, I'm reading a little bit about it and some of the things that he's alleged to have said and things. Yeah, it does not come off great, but again, I guess this didn't happen.
Yeah. And well, that's the thing though. So the story that he tells is that it was a consensual sexual encounter and he cheated on his girlfriend, future wife. And allegedly his wife said he told her about it. Years later, they reconciled, she forgave him, etc. But it's just still really fucking weird.
Just some of the stuff that he's even alleged to have said is just very strange.
It is. So, you know, at the very worst, he's a cheater, but that's the thing. Nobody denies they had sex. That's the wild part. It's just very uncomfortable. But hey, you know what? Good for him. He didn't get convicted. I'll just say, I'm not going to say it's good or bad. I'm just saying good for him. He didn't get convicted.
Congratulations. If you want to come on the show and tell us what happened, sure.
And that is what I alluded to earlier when I said that Wolf Creek 3 and the TV show are in development hell, because this basically destroyed his career overnight.
I see. Yeah, and he's like the centerpiece of the franchise, seems like.
He is absolutely the face of this franchise for sure. So unfortunately, with that morbid note aside, let's get back to even more morbidity here with the plot. So Liz sets the now dismantled cars, because yeah, once again, Mick completely destroyed their only way of escaping, on fire to distract him. And she goes to help Christy while he's distracted. Now, there's certain things that I'm not going to get into all the details on what is heavily implied that Mick does to Christy here, but there's some pretty gnarly environmental storytelling in the shed. There's like a mutilated, beheaded woman like nailed to the shed wall that he makes some pretty horrifying statements about that he probably did to her. Just morbid stuff. A lot of the violence in this movie is heavily implied and told through the environmental storytelling, which I really appreciate.
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting thing about this to me. So this is ostensibly, I think you'd agree, what might have been called in the mid-2000s a torture porn movie. That was kind of the definitive horror genre, I think, of the 2000s. I already think that's kind of a weird term. I don't really know if I think it's a real thing to most degrees. What's interesting is this movie, well, I assume that a lot of critics probably assume, I assume that's what Roger Ebert thought of it. The actual violence in here, with a couple of exceptions, is really not protracted. Wolf Creek is kind of more about the threat of violence in the air, kind of the presence of violence, as opposed to lingering on like the details of it.
Yes, and in fact, talking about Roger Ebert, I believe, because in his review, because I did read a little bit of his excerpt on his terrible review once again, that he walked out of the theater, I believe, during the Christie torture scene.
I assumed.
I mean, to be fair, it is, in my opinion, easily the most horrifying scene in the movie. But other than that, there really isn't that much torture in this movie for the most part.
Yeah, not on screen, no. Other than this scene with Christy that we're at now, it's mostly kind of about the atmosphere. For me, a lot of it is about, again, like I said, the oppressive heat, this feeling of like kind of
isolation
and sweat and isolation. Yeah. The dark, like beating heat of like the outback, but not necessarily about watching this really elaborate, grotesque mutilation in kind of surgical detail, like say Martyrs or Hostel is.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, when people call this torture porn, like, I don't really agree that this is torture porn, because even the torture that is in this movie is definitely not very sensual. Although
Well,
torture porn was a derogatory term, I understand, but if we're taking it literally. And
right.
also, yeah, you're
Well,
right. There's not much actual, like, yeah, limbs flying off and people, like, getting their faces ripped. There's none of that in this movie, just to be clear here.
since you kind of stumbled across or wandered to, part of my problem with the phrase torture porn has always been that people use it to describe a type of gratuitous horror movie with an emphasis on torture. And it's always bothered me because I've always thought, I'm pretty sure that there's a more literal thing called torture porn.
Yeah.
Like, I hate to spell it out.
No, I think it was a way for critics to just be shitty towards like a film subgenre that they just didn't understand or like.
And the thing is that most of those films are not my favorite type of horror movie. I find them, again, to be more often unpleasant than scary per se. But I think the phrase torture porn, I think at this point it's become enough of a codified thing that you can use it. But I feel like, what do the Saw films and Martyrs, for instance, have in common?
Very little, because in the Saw movies, and I've talked about the Saw movies a trillion times, I understand, but I have one point to make about it. The violence in the Saw movies is always just ridiculously goofy and oftentimes even campy, whereas the violence in Martyrs is not that.
Well, the thing with Saw, to just go on a little tangent, to me, those are pretty much like an update on slasher movies, where it's all about these spectacular, fantastical death sequences in the same way that Nightmare on Elm Street or Friday the 13th would have been.
Oh, absolutely. 100%, yeah.
Whereas, again, Martyrs, which I do I think is a good film, but I'll probably never watch it again, is basically a meditation on violence. It's not so much about being we're going to scare you. It's you're going to see exactly what, this brutal violence is. And I would say Wolf Creek is similar to that, but it's less about the explicit graphic detail and more about making you live in that state,
No, 100%. Yeah, this is definitely not a movie if you're feeling depressed or anxious to probably watch. I would not recommend that, especially if you're a woman.
It's not a fun horror movie.
And well, speaking of fun, I do have a not fun fact here. So when Mick is using her for target practice, that is a thing that Ivan Milat did to his victims as well.
So actually, the target practice scene, I assumed when you see her get hit in the face, I assumed that was cut from the theatrical.
No, actually, none of the torture stuff was cut from the theatrical cut. None of it. I looked this up directly because I wanted to find everything that was cut.
Watching this last night, I watched the rubber bounce off of her face, and the let's up, and I went, oh, that was cut. Even though it's a blank or whatever, you're watching a bullet hit this woman's face. I was like, oh, that was cut from the theatrical. I'm sure it was. That's interesting to me.
Also, when Mick says, the fucking hunged up corpse in the shed, he's like, oh, she was fun for a month until she went off with her head. Ivan Milat also beheaded his victims. Very bad man, Ivan Milat. There's a reason why he was one of the few Australians to ever get life without parole. He was a real piece of shit.
I actually think that he was set up. Friend of the pod, Ivan Milat.
His family actually said that. In fact, their theory was because when he was caught and convicted, the Sydney Olympics were just announced, and they thought that was a distraction to show that Australia cared about solving crime.
Get the fuck out of here. Come the fuck on, man.
Almost all of his family believed that he didn't do it. Although, hilariously enough, one of his nephews in the future would actually kidnap another person along with a couple of his friends and also murder him in the same forest where his uncle committed the crimes.
Oh, cool.
That family's just fucked altogether. But all right, let's get back to the plot once again. So when Mick returns, Liz shoots him with his rifle. And I really like the scene because, she's shaking. She's obviously very scared. She doesn't really know what to do. She doesn't know if the gun's really going to come off. And I also love when Mick, he almost does a gun control, listen, a gun in the wrong hands. Yeah, he does a gun control statement.
That's a great charismatic villain moment.
And then I love how he screams out, give me the fucking gun back.
Give me the fucking gun, yeah.
Then he shoots him right in the neck or right in the cheek or whatever. And also, by the way, I don't know if we've talked about it too much, but John Jarratt is fucking phenomenal in this movie.
Scary as fuck.
Scary as fuck. His accent is just on point. He is just the perfect stereotypical Australian redneck. Just phenomenal. There's a reason why they made an entire series out of this character.
And even before he switches to full on, committing these evil acts, the way that he plays this kind of animosity bubbling under the surface is so good.
No, for sure, 100%. I mean, the thing that's interesting about this movie, too, is that John Jarratt was the only person to audition for this role. Nobody else auditioned, and I couldn't imagine anybody else would do as good of a job. I'm just going to be real here.
Oh, yeah. Maybe in more ways.
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately.
But another thing that I thought was really interesting watching this is a lot of times in a horror movie, you've got your quote unquote, your final girl or your protagonist, but they have to go through a period of being kind of powerless before they decide it's time to fight back. Liz doesn't really have that. She pretty immediately wakes up and decides she's going to like fight for her life, which I thought was refreshing. She doesn't go through this period of being like, oh, help me, you know what I mean? Or which you see a lot in horror movies. She basically comes to, she's like traumatized, obviously, but she figures out what's going on and she immediately is like, I need to get out of here.
Yeah, and to be fair, Christy does that, obviously, but it is the contrast between, badass, powerful, like tiny woman who's still able to take on this fucking giant, vicious serial killer. And she almost succeeds, but of course she does not. The women attempt to flee in Mick's truck after, once again, Liz shoots him in the neck. And, people kind of complain about this one, but, once again, Mick gets shot in the neck. He's on the ground. Christy's like, Liz, kill him. And, like, she doesn't really kill him. She just, like, beats him with the butt of the rifle, which I found out in the special features that they actually beat his actual body with the butt of the rifle pretty hard. They got it on the first take because, like, he wakes up, he's like, oh, I'm gonna feel that in the morning. It's like,
yeah, no shit.
But also, like, people complain about it, but it's like, you have to understand, this woman's fucking scared out of her mind. Like, she is very courageous, but she's scared out of her fucking mind. She sees dead bodies everywhere. She's trying to help her friend, who's very clearly been horrifically traumatized, too. She doesn't know how a fucking gun works, because also Australia has had comprehensive gun control since 1996. She's also British in the movie, too. So she extra doesn't know how a fucking gun works. So she's doing the best she can, okay? Like, stop being a dick about it. She got one shot. She did okay. Like, seriously.
And the thing is, if we were watching a slasher movie, like a more fantasy-based slasher movie, I'd say, come on, you've got a chance. But this movie takes place in our reality. It takes place in the real world, where I can't expect my protagonists to behave that way.
No, for sure, 100%. But so once again, they try to flee in Mick's truck, and he stumbles out the garage and tries to shoot them before giving chase. The women evade him by pushing his truck off a cliff before returning to the site to get another car. So yeah, they push the car off the cliff. They like hide behind the cliff, and Mick's like, oh, those bitches, they fucking ran off with my truck or whatever. And like, that's also another genius thing, because I would have never thought to do that if I was in this situation. I would just kept fucking running. When they go back to his area, which Christy's like, don't go back, let's keep going. I'll be honest, if I had fooled him into thinking that I had died and he was like, oh, I'm just gonna go back, I would just run. I would never look back. I would fucking run. And the fact that you have one of your friends with you is extra. Like, fuck the other person. I'm just leaving.
I would just want to keep moving, yeah.
I would place my bets and just get the fuck out of here. I don't care if there's nobody for 50 miles. I'm walking, motherfucker.
Yeah.
But anyway, she does go back, try to find a car. And also, while Liz is snooping around the complex, she finds evidence that Mick Taylor's been doing this for a very long time, finds cameras, news articles about missing people, finds videos. At one point, she goes down a mine shaft where she finds rotting corpses. And actually, that was the one major scene that was taken completely out of the theatrical cut.
Okay. So this scene for me, this is actually the scariest scene in the movie, not the actual violence we see. It's, for whatever reason, that really hits me is the kind of understanding that there's been so many more of these, that it's not just these girls and this random one off and the guy. This is like a thing he's been doing forever. Yeah, and something about that is like the way it hits is like it changes. I think the whole way you're thinking like, oh, this is like a random act of violence, and I guess it is. But to see like how insignificant it is to Mick Taylor to do this.
Yeah, he has a whole like garage of cars of people that he's killed. Crazy. And then, yeah, like I said, you see news clippings, you see videos featuring children. I mean, it's just pretty heavy. And, of course, once again, this was based on Ivan Milat. Now, he never killed children, as far as I'm aware of. He only killed backpackers. So that's why he was called the backpacker killer. But still, yeah, the implied, like, scope of his violence is genuinely the most unsettling part of this movie, in my opinion. And even though I don't think it's the most important part to really drive the point home, I think it's really a shame that they cut the rotting corpse in the mine shaft out of the theatrical cut. I think that sucks.
Yeah. It also seems like, was that really the thing that was pushing this over from R to unrated? Like, really?
Yeah. You would think if there was any cuts, it would be in the torture scene, but like this scene specifically, very bizarre.
Yeah.
whatever, it is what it is. But then, yeah, Liz eventually enters a garage and discovers Mick's large stock of cars and traveler's possessions once again, including their video camera, where they actually, because Ben also does like a home footage, like jerk off thing earlier, and they actually see Mick's truck in the background, which I actually, when I rewatched the movie, you can also very clearly see it in the background too, which I find very interesting.
Yeah.
It's shown in the video he had followed them long before they got to Wolf Creek. In fact, at the pub scene where those guys were sexually harassing those girls. And of course, she's like, what's going to get the fuck out of here? She finds a car key, turns the ignition, and of course, Mick is right behind her in the back seat, stabs her right in the back. And as she's crawling out of the car, she grabs a little pocket knife. And of course, Brian, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Call that a knife. This is a knife. And goes at her with the knife, cuts off her fingers, which there was apparently 2 seconds of cut footage of her fingers rolling on the ground. So another minor cut. But yeah, so he cuts off her fingers. She's like, obviously, you know, scared and injured, and he's like taunting her the whole time. And then he picks her up and does what I think is probably the single most infamous and talked about scene in this whole movie, the infamous head on a stick scene, where he takes a knife, severs her spinal cord, drops her on the ground. Yeah, and he says, oh, there you are, head on a stick. And she's just like obviously barely breathing, because that's what happens when obviously her spinal cord gets severed at a certain point. And once again, Brian, to be the bearer of bad news, that was also something that Ivan Milat did to his victims.
I had a feeling watching this, because that's such a specific thing. I was like, oh, this is one of the things Taylor alluded to in our messages that was from real life, just because it's such a specific act.
Yeah, so that is a thing Ivan Milat did in real life too. So taken directly from the headlines.
And that's one of the things with this film, is that it feels more like it's like giving you an insight into these kinds of murders rather than existing to be like just scary. You know, I mean, it is thrilling, it's exciting, but really to me, it's less about telling a scary story. It's like a documentation almost, you know, a dramatization of these crimes.
Exactly. And then, you know, speaking of further documentation here, so once again, Christy does not follow Liz on her journey. She awakens because, of course, she was just horribly tortured and she's probably exhausted. She wakes up and she's like, oh shit, it's been 5 minutes, I gotta fuck off. And so, of course, she runs. She finds a passing motorist. He attempts to help her, but is shot dead by Mick with a hunting rifle. And she grabs his keys, fucking tries driving off. He's taunting her the whole way. She's obviously scared. He gets her off the road for a little bit, but, you know, Mick gets his rifle, shoots out her tire. She tries calling out of the car. Mick kills her. That's the end of Christy, and presumably the end of Liz, because we don't actually see Liz dying, but let's be clear, Liz is dead.
Where was she going?
Yeah, it's like the end of Driver and Law Abiding Citizen and all the movies we've talked about. They're just going to die. Like, that's just the reality.
This last stretch here where she keeps almost escaping, or you feel like she might be about to, is, and I don't mean this in a negative way, I'm just saying objectively, it is exhausting.
It is absolutely exhausting. And then once he kills her, you're almost kind of relieved, because like, well, at least he's not going to torture her anymore. I'm just going to be honest with you.
At least it's over.
So then Mick bundles her body and the dead motorist into the back of his car and torches the car. And then in the last 10 minutes here, we see Ben awakens, nailed to a mock crucifix in the mine shaft. Now, interestingly enough, they did kind of allude to him in a scene before, which I kind of wish they hadn't done. I kind of wish they had just like did a hard cut and then you just see him waking up here, because that would have been actually kind of wild.
Same.
It's like, oh shit, we totally forgot about Ben.
We would have forgot about him, and then,
So, of course, he extracts himself from there by pulling his arm through the crucifix. It's obviously pretty painful too, but nothing in comparison to what these girls went through, but still horrible.
Yeah.
You see another tied up guy whose like lower body was eaten. I assume that Mick used them as like food for his dogs. I don't know that, but I'm just going to assume that's what happened. It's what's going to implied violence, but I assume that's what happened. So,
is there any precedent for anything like that in any of the cases this was inspired by?
No. So Ivan Milat did, once again, torture his victims, use them as target practice, sever their spinal cords, beheaded them, etc.
But no cannibalism or feeding to animals?
He basically killed people, obviously, for the thrill of it, and also for the modicum of financial gain he got from stealing their possessions, essentially.
Okay.
But yeah, so Ben escapes into the outback. So this is my feminist analysis here. So this movie, the two genders couldn't be further apart. So all the men in this movie are either predatory, gross, or cowardly. So Ben, the second he gets out, he doesn't think about the girls at all. He's like, zoinks, I'm getting the fuck out of here. And he just runs the fuck away. Whereas Liz, of course, she's like, oh, I got to save my friend. And Chrissy's like, oh, well, you know, I'll stay around, but like, I still have to watch out for myself. And, you know, obviously, like, they kind of care for each other's safety too, of course. But yeah, the effete, like, urbanite guy is just like, nope, fuck these bitches.
I'm gone.
Out of here.
Yeah. Based.
Yeah, based as fuck. So, and that's the thing though, right? Is that we're talking about patriarchy and violence. So obviously women are the ultimate victims of patriarchy and violence, whereas men, even if generally they are the victims of violence, it's not the protracted violence. It's generally either pretty quick or they're able to escape from it, or they're the perpetrators of it most of the time as well. So that's like a feminist analysis you can get from this movie.
Our male victim, even at the hands of Mick Taylor, the violence he suffers, which is being crucified, is sort of an afterthought of Mick's. It's, it's a necessity to get this guy out of the way, rather than the part that it seems like, as far as we know, he's spending his time with the women, torturing them. And he's just got this guy, kind of out of his way, pinned up on a wall so he doesn't have to deal with him, and will probably kill him relatively quickly.
Yeah, a guy that he'll probably use as, like, yeah, I said, to probably feed his dogs or something like that. Like, he is just an afterthought 100%. But yeah, so he's able to run away. He's eventually discovered by a German couple. Now, here's a little morbid detail. So the car that they're driving, that little bus thing, was a recreation of the car that Peter Falcone and his girlfriend were driving when Bradley John Murdoch picked them up. So yeah, some very grim parts of this movie once again.
Nice little Easter egg for the real heads.
Exactly. And I believe in the state where it happened, which once again, I believe it was Northern Australia or is Western Australia. It's one of those two places. But this film was actually pushed back until the trial was over because, once again, this movie was partially based on the Bradley John Murdoch case as well. So they had a little nod in there. But yeah, so he's eventually saved, airlifted to a hospital. There's some title cards indicating that police bumbled their way finding evidence. Like, they believe Ben was the actual culprit behind this, which I don't know why the fuck you would think he was the actual culprit behind this. That's insane to think. There's things that people do to obviously cover up evidence of a crime, but you would never crucify yourself. Insanity. But that's the thing, though, is that I saw a tweet a little while ago that said, like, there's not very many actually, like, genius serial killers. It's mostly about police incompetence, which is absolutely the fucking truth.
Yes.
And this movie very much clarifies that with the very end, because Mick is able to just get away with it. He literally walks into the sunset and disappears, and that's the movie, folks. And I also do want to say before we get into our final thoughts, so Greg McLean initially wanted to make Mick Taylor into the Australian boogeyman. And I think he did a pretty goddamn good job because he's like the most like infamous Australian villain I can think of in modern pop culture.
Yeah. Seems like, especially from what you've told me, especially within the country. Yeah. I mean, there at least was a whole franchise building around this character.
Yeah, like I said, a whole TV show and 2 sequels, which one of them being in development hell, of course. But still, like, this was a franchise based off of pretty much just the charisma of our villain. And to be fair, I will say our 3 victims for a horror movie in the mid-2000s are pretty good performers. Like, I felt really, really bad, obviously. And, of course, you feel bad when any character in a movie gets tortured. That's not like a monster. But, like, Christie's genuine, like, cries and screams of terror are some of the most haunting I've seen in a horror movie in a long time.
There's a real bewilderment to it, I guess, that feels very real to me. A real, like, wondering of, like, why is this happening? That comes out in her voice. It's very unsettling.
Yeah, and in the special features that I watched, apparently 4 out of the 25 shooting days were shooting just the scenes surrounding her torture. So she was screaming like that for 4 days. So rough stuff, I will say. And that actress, she should have gotten an award for that shit. But yeah, before we get into the Amazon reviews, Brian, do you have any thoughts?
So this was very intense viewing. At the time of recording, not the time that you are listening. We are just coming into November, so I just finished up watching a lot of horror movies for October. And I'm going to say, so this particular era, this type of horror film, it's not a kind that I watch a lot, in part because I just missed the boat on a lot of it in the 2000s, in part because a lot of it is, it's not necessarily that I don't like things that are really unpleasant, but a lot of this kind of stuff with the true crime angle, it's both unpleasant and kind of straightforward for me. Initially watching this, I had to sit with it for a while before I really kind of grapple with it, before I really appreciated it. Wolf Creek is, like you said, it's a first and second act. The first act is all meeting our characters and building tension, and the second act is just mayhem, violence, and malice. The thing that really strikes me and works for me about it, as I said earlier, is this feeling of oppressive heat, of darkness in the outback, these long stretches of desert, and the feeling that you're like right on your tail is this like malevolent killer. And that starts basically 44 minutes in and it does not stop. There are a few things in this movie that are very 2005 in a way that I did not care for, particularly the handheld shaky cam one of my least favorite directing styles. And I would say probably about half of this movie, because this is not, a found footage film, but it is a lot of the time shot like one. And I see how that is a creative choice and how it suits the style of the movie. But to be honest, it makes me kind of nauseous. So I was kind of like, okay, because I love the first Blair Witch Project. I know people love to clown on that movie, but there I'm kind of like, okay, there's a specific reason that this is a handheld camera. Whereas when I see it in a movie that isn't found footage, I'm kind of like, well, now they're just making me sick for no reason.
No, absolutely. So my thoughts before we get into Amazon reviews, I will say I really did like this movie. It's very unsettling. It is, once again, very unpleasant, gnarly. But I think for the kind of movie that it was trying to be, I think it hit those points pretty well, especially for how low of a budget this movie was. Because I don't know this for sure, but I'm assuming a lot of the budget went to just getting John Jarratt himself. Because once again, John Jarratt by Australian standards is a big actor. So having him be your villain in the movie, I'm sure probably cost a pretty big chunk of the budget of this movie.
He does seem to really be relishing it. Like, he really seems to be enjoying this. So maybe they didn't have to bribe him too hard.
Maybe that Better Home and Gardens money was still coming in at that point. He was also on like a family sitcom during filming of this movie. So like, yeah, very strange choice to have as this like just awful, torturous monster in this movie. But yeah, I was kind of surprised by how much I liked this movie in hindsight, because I'd first watched this movie, I would say probably when I was like somewhere in high school, because I remember picking this up on DVD from Mega Media Exchange back when I was like in high school or so. And I remember liking it at the time, but not really, I think, appreciating it as much, because a lot of 2000s horror was, once again, not that dissimilar to this movie, if I'm being honest with you here. But this movie in hindsight, especially now watching it with more adult, more mature eyes, less teenage, dipshit, borderline psychopath eyes, as most teenagers are, and just seeing the like actual thematic horror on these people's faces as they're experiencing this genuinely gave me like dread and terror. Whereas a lot of other horror movies at this time just did not do that. So I was impressed with how much this movie was able to unsettle me, fucking almost 20 years after it came out.
And I think one of the things I was thinking about watching it is like just how prevalent this tone of horror was, like how bleak it was. Because when you look back at even like the Scream series in the 90s, I think at the time people thought those were going to be the horror movies of the future, or like these meta commentaries. But what we learned a few years later was that really the horror movies of the new millennium were very monochromatic, very grisly, kind of like misanthropic films.
Yeah, for sure. All right, before we get into our final thoughts, though, I really want to get on these Amazon reviews, because you know what? These are some of the best Amazon reviews I've ever seen for anything we've ever reviewed on the show. I have 3, but 2 of them are very, very short. So this first one here is a 4-star review. This is from Barry, and the header of his review says, "If I tell you, I'm going to have to kill you." I can't do the laugh, by the way, but that was my best impression of it.
Pretty good. Not bad.
Hell yeah. And the body of the review says, "Hardcore horror fans take note. This highly intense Australian horror film will not disappoint fans of this genre. The violence is graphic. I won't lie to you about that. It concerns 3 20-something people, 2 women and a man, who are traveling across the Australian outback. Their destination is Wolf Creek, a large crater in the middle of the outback, which has been made into a kind of national park. Well, it is actually a national park, but whatever. They park their car and begin a hike into the crater, which, according to a sign posted, will take about 3 or 4 hours. When they return, their car won't start." Ouch. I love that. Ouch.
Ouch.
Like the Chad meme of the shirt that says ouch on it. Night falls and our 3 friends are still stranded out in the middle of nowhere trying to figure out what to do. All of a sudden, a large pickup truck pulls up out of the darkness. Out of the truck comes Mick Taylor, a friendly, middle-aged Australian man with a Crocodile Dundee hat. He offers to fix their car, but he must tow it back to his camp to do it. The 3 friends decide to take him up on his offer. Big mistake! Exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point.
This guy is like not reading the room for the tone of this film.
Yeah.
That's going to leave a mark.
Mr. Taylor, you see, is a psychopath in every sense of the word. Okay, don't talk about me like that, okay? I'm not that big of a piece of shit. The terror he subjects these people to is beyond belief. The rest you will have to see for yourself. Not many people saw this film during its theatrical release. The decision to release it on Christmas Day was somewhat strange. Yes, this movie was released on Christmas Day in America. I totally failed to mention that.
Aw.
I saw it the day after New Year's. I recommended it to a guy at work. We haven't stopped talking about it. Not a day goes by that we don't quote a line or something from it. It's become sort of a tradition.
I hope their coworkers and like clients are hearing them talk about this movie all the time and like, what the fuck are these guys doing?
John Jarrett, who plays the Psycho Mick Taylor, deserves recognition for his performance. Check it out. It's a must for any serious horror film buffs collection. That's the review here. Guy clearly doesn't know how to read the room, and he has a very weird relationship with his coworker, but you know what? Not a terrible review otherwise.
He's watching the scene where she gets like tortured and he goes, so that happened.
Oh, Jesus Christ. And speaking of weird guys, let's get into our next review here. So both our last reviews are 1-star reviews, but like I said, they're very short. So JM gives this 1 star, and the head of the review says, why 1 star? ? And the body of the review says, because my girlfriend keeps watching Prime movies on my PC and doesn't realize I have to pay for them. And by the way, I did not make an error here. He literally spells it girlfriend.
This guy rules. Just leaving a bad review for my girlfriend.
No, Brian, his girlfriend.
He's so mad he's like typing wrong. He left this review and then he left the page open on his laptop logged in so his girlfriend would see it. That's why he wrote this.
This stupid booch.
This stupid butch.
And speaking of stupid butches, let's get into our final review here from Denard Montrell, who gives us 1 star. And the head of the review says, bad movie. And the body of the review says, hated it. And for some reason, he also includes a picture of his face in the review.
Just frowning.
No, he's like smiling with like a star filter in the background.
Oh, please make that the album art for this episode. Please. We just use a poster, but please.
I'll make it like 2 pixels big and put it in the side.
Please. It's just incredible what people put in fucking reviews.
Yeah, this guy just has like the most blank smile expression you've ever seen. And yeah, it's just like a space filter in the background. He put it in the review for some reason.
Awesome. My favorite review that we found.
Yeah. Oh man, Jesus fucking Christ. But yes, so those are our Amazon reviews. So we're now at the end of the episode. We actually decided to record a little earlier for once because we're just 2 old-ass millennials who are just too old to keep talking about movies. So do we have any final thoughts before we both get our warm milk and go to bed, Brian?
Wolf Creek is very 2005. It's very bleak. It's not actually as graphically violent as you'd think, but it's not a fun time. If you're really into true crime, you'll probably like it. If you're more into like fun slasher good versus evil movies, maybe not.
No, for sure, 100%. Yeah, if you're a fan of very viscerally scary horror movies and you really want to watch a movie that will kind of push you to the limits of that, once again, as long as you're not a female victim of sexual assault, I would recommend this movie because this is a very effective, good horror movie with not a lot of on-screen violence, which I appreciate in a modern horror movie because I don't really like, for the most part, a lot of like super gory shit to like kind of make it scary because for the most part, it usually falls flat. But a lot of implied violence works very, very well on me.
It gets under your skin a little more.
100%. So yeah, I couldn't recommend this movie more for that. And especially if you're looking for good examples of horror movies in the 2000s, which, yeah, once again, pretty weak decade for horror. But if you want a good example of that, I would definitely recommend checking this movie out. All right, so let's get into the pluggables. So unfortunately, Brian, his warm milk kicked in a little too early. So I'm going to have to do the pluggables by myself here, but that's totally fine. I'm perfectly used to plugging myself all the time, if you know what I mean, ladies. But anyways, let's get to the pluggables here. So you can follow me at Carlos Chantor on twitter.com, otherwise known as x.com. And you can follow Brian at JonStabb, JONSTABB, at twitter.com or x.com. Also, if you want, you can follow us on Spotify because we are uploading episodes consistently to both YouTube and Spotify now. So you can get both of those as soon as they air. Not sure exactly when I'm going to air them, but I'm going to try to air them about once a week. And also, the last pluggable I have here, and the most recent one I have. So, remember when we interviewed Scott and Sean? Well, Scott and Sean have a new fundraiser for their sequel to the original Lucifer and the Father show that we mentioned on our interview. It is, once again, now live. It is going until December 28th. and the stretch goal is $10,000. I should say the initial funding goal is $10,000, although it is a flexible goal. So if you want to donate, please feel free to donate. Go to indiegogo.com/project/Lucifer and the Father sequel. I will post it in the episode description for both Spotify and YouTube. Once again, thank you very much for listening to this episode. Brian gives his regards, but like I said, he is fast asleep right now. That warm milk and Blanky and Cookie are really working very beautifully on him. I can hear the snoring in the background right now. But have a good night, everybody.